Now, with the changes we made over the last lectures, we are able to gather our expense data, our user input, and combine it into this object and clear the form thereafter. The only problem is that having this data is nice, but we technically don't need it in the expense form component, do we? Instead, we need it in the new expense, or to be precise, in the app.js component even, because there we have our expenses array, and ultimately our goal will be to add this new expense, which the user entered, to this list of existing expenses. And we probably also want to enrich it by adding an ID. So we need to pass the data, which we're collecting and generating in expense form, to the app component. Now, up to this point, we only learned how we can pass data down. So how we can, for example, in the expenses folder, pass the title, amount, and date from the expenses component to the expense items component. So from parent to child. That's something we learned. We can do that with props. But how can we do it in the other direction if data is generated in the expense form and we then want to pass it up to the app component? Well, actually, we already saw how it works, but it's easy to miss it. So let me show it to you again. In expense form, we are listening to user input, to changes to the title input, for example. And whenever the user types there, this function, title change handler, executes, and there we get this default event object. That's something the browser gives us. Now, actually, we can think about this input element here as a component as well. It's not one of our components, but it is simply a pre-built component, we could say, provided to us by React and of course translated to the input DOM element. But it has this component character in the end. And we do also set some props on that component, including this special onChange prop. Now actually, this onChange prop isn't that special, it's just a prop named onChange, which wants a function as a value. And then internally, the input element adds this event listener. So React basically sees that we set a value on this onChange prop and adds that listener on the rendered input element. But that is a pattern we can replicate for our own components as well. We can create our own event props, if we want to call it like this, and we can expect functions as values, and that would allow us to pass a function from a parent component to a child component and then call that function inside of the child component. And when we then call a function, we can of course pass data to that function as a parameter. And that's how we can communicate up from child to parent. Now, in case this was too quick, let me simply show it to you. Let's say we want to pass the expense data, which we gather in the expense form component, to the new expense component as a first step. Because if we ultimately want to reach the app component, we first of all have to reach the new expense component, because it's the new expense component which uses the expense form. And then in a second step later, it's the app component which uses the new expense component. But we can't skip components in between. That's also something you learned in the previous course section. Props can only be passed from parent to child. We can't skip intermediate components. So therefore, as a first step, let's make sure we can pass the expense data to new expense. And we can do this by adding a new prop to expense form. It's our component, so we can name it however we want, but I will name it on save expense data. But the name is totally up to you. I'm just naming it on something because I want to make it clear that the value for this prop should be a function which will eventually be triggered when something happens inside of this component. In this case, when the user saves the entered expense data, so when the form is submitted in the end. So that's again a convention I'm following. You don't have to name it like this. You can name it however you want. It's totally up to you. It doesn't have to start with on. I just do start with on to follow this convention and to make it clear that the value for this prop should be a function which can then be called inside of the expense form component. Hence, it's a function we should define here in NewExpense, just as we did it for the input elements with the functions we bound to the onChange prop. We defined those in the expense form before we returned the JSX code as well. Now we're doing the same here, one level above that in the NewExpense component for our own custom expense form component. So here I'll add a const, save expense data handler, and important, as a parameter here, I will expect the entered expense data. The name of the parameter is up to you. It's your function. But now I make it clear that this function expects to get this parameter. And then here we can add our expense data, another object, copy in the entered expense data, which I expect to be that object which we generate here in the submit handler, so this object. I pull out all the key value pairs and add them to this new object, and then I add in a new key, the ID key, and simply set that to math random toString to convert it to a string. It's not a perfect unique ID. Theoretically, we could generate the same value twice, but it's good enough for this demo. And then we can see what we do with that thereafter. For the moment, I'll just log this enriched expense data. Now it's a pointer at this function, which I want to pass as a value to onSaveExpenseData. So that this onSaveExpenseData prop in my custom component receives this function as a value. Again, I don't execute it here. We don't add parentheses. I just point at the function so that the function itself, a pointer at it, is passed to expense form. Now that's the first step. The second step now is to use this function inside of our custom component. That's a step we didn't have to do for the inputs, because these are built-in components basically. But there also, we pass a function to onChange, and internally React then will add a listener and call this function which we pass in whenever that event occurs, that change event. Now, since we're doing this on our own custom component, we also have to call the passed in function manually. And that's what I'll do next. So inside of expense form, we now can expect this onSaveExpenseData prop because I am setting it when I use the expense form component. Hence, inside of expense form, we can extract the value passed for this prop, i.e. this function. So inside of expense form, I of course now expect to get some props because we're setting a prop now. And now inside of the submit handler, instead of logging my expense data, I will access props onSaveExpenseData and execute it here. And that's now important. Now I execute it. I can execute it because the value which we get on this onSaveExpenseData key will be a function. We are passing in a function here after all. So it's this function defined in the NewExpense component, which we will now execute in a different component, inside of expense form to be precise. And we can execute the function even though it's not defined inside of expense form, because we are passing a pointer at it through the onSaveExpenseData prop. And this is a super important pattern which you will use a lot in React. This is how you can communicate between components and how you can communicate up. How you can make sure that a child component, the expense form component here, for example, can communicate up to the parent component, the NewExpense component in this case. We can call a function in the NewExpense component and we can pass data as a parameter. So here, when we call onSaveExpenseData in the expense form, I can pass the expense data which I generate here as an argument. And that's the value which we'll receive as a parameter here in NewExpense. I hope this flow is clear. The trick really is that we pass around a pointer at a function. Now if we go back and I reload, if I again enter something here and pick a date, if I click add expense, you see this is being logged to the console and it's being logged from the NewExpense file line 12. So it's this log here. And we can tell that it's from there because we also have an ID field there which has this random number which is generated and converted to a string. And that's how we can communicate up. And this is a super important pattern. Now, of course, we can continue in this chain now. And we can communicate up from inside NewExpense to app, because it's this app component which needs the NewExpense in the end to add it to this expenses array. So therefore, again, in app.js, we can add a function which we define before we return JSX code, and we can simply name this add expense handler. And we expect to get our expense here as a parameter, and then we do something with it. And for the moment, I'll just console log in app.js and console log the expense, because we haven't quite yet learned how we can render lists of data dynamically. And therefore, for the moment, I will not update the expenses array. That is something we'll do and learn about in the next course section though. For the moment, I just want to confirm that the data arrived. So here's the function. Now again, using the same pattern as before, we can pass a pointer at this function to NewExpense, so that inside of NewExpense we can call this function and pass that expense data up to the app component. So we could name this prop here on add expense. Again, the name is up to you. It's your component. But again, I will follow this convention, starting with on to make it clear that it's a function pointer, which is passed as an argument. And then I pass a pointer at add expense handler to the on expense prop on NewExpense. And therefore, inside of NewExpense, we can now call that. We can accept the props argument here as well, this parameter. And in save expense data handler, which itself is called when something happens in the expense form, we can of course now also call props on add expense. And of course here we want to use the name which we chose here in the app component. We're calling the function passed as a value for that on add expense prop. I'm calling this here, and I will forward my enriched expense data here. And if we now save everything, again, if I reload and I add a book here for $12.99, if I click add expense, this is being logged from inside the app component, as we can clearly tell. And I'm actually logging the expenses as I see. I wanted to log the expense instead, so let me fix this. Let me give this another try. A book, $12.99, pick a date. Yeah, so now we're logging the single expense. Again, we'll use that expense and change the array and output the array dynamically too. We'll do that in the next course section. But for the moment, I wanted to focus on that state and event handling thing. And being able to pass data up is a crucial part of that. And here's how it works.